Okay, so I just went over the arbitrariness objection, but I want to see something about Socrates' objection to this proposal from Euthyphro. And I've already written it down. It looks something like this. Socrates makes a kind of analogy to other ways in which items or objects can be affected. And so he talks about seeing and being seen, about carrying and being carried, which I've written down here, about loved and being loved. And so he asks something like this. Is whatever we're talking about, X in this case, well, is it being carried because it's a carried thing? And he says, no, there's nothing essential about X being a carried thing. That doesn't seem to make sense. That's not what we would say. Rather, we would say something like X is a carried thing because it's actively being carried. And so he draws an analogy to the case of the pious. Likewise, the pious is the case that the pious is beloved because it's a loved thing? And so here, likewise, the answer is no. Rather, the pious is a loved thing because it's actively being loved. There's nothing essential about the pious in terms of being a loved thing. It just so happens, in the case that Euthyphro is proposing, it just so happens that the gods would love the pious. And so part of what Socrates is getting after here is that there seems to be a difference between what X is, what piety is, in and of itself, versus a kind of quality or status or affect of X. It's a kind of inessential property of X. It could be the case that the pious or the right thing to do just is whatever it happens to be the right thing to do, whether or not it happens to be loved by all the gods, whether or not they all agree. And so part of what Socrates is suggesting with this undermining of Euthyphro's proposal is that even if it were true that all of the gods happen to love piety, that doesn't actually get at what the essential nature of what piety actually is. It just bespeaks of a certain kind of quality or a way that piety is being affected by something else, namely the gods. And so again, there's nothing on this proposal which actually captures a definition or any kind of essential aspect of what piety is. And so Socrates remains unsatisfied with this kind of proposal. Now I want to say something about these two because at this point there are a couple more ideas. Well, I'll call them 6, 7, and 8, but they're going to go a little bit quicker. I want to suggest a way that many people, many philosophers have taken the last couple of ideas in the Euthyphro. Here's the issue. If you recall point number 3, and it's suggesting that what is dear to the gods, or what is beloved by the gods, constitutes what piety is. We saw that on one proposal, insofar as they would disagree with each other, that would produce a contradiction. But on that proposal, that seems as though it affects a kind of polytheistic framework in which there are many gods who would disagree. But the importance of the other proposal, indeed for us contemporaries, is that even if all the gods agree on that supposition between these two ideas, point number 4 it was, even if all the gods agree in a way that would be akin to a monotheistic conception. Because in a sense, it's as if a god were agreeing with himself, or there was no disagreement of a god with himself. Even then, this is the way this is taken by many contemporary philosophers, it would be irrelevant. to what the pious thing is or what the right thing to do is. For the reasons that we've just given, the objections we've given, the arbitrariness objection, the idea that whatever happens to be the right thing would have to be over and above a god or the gods. And likewise, that the fact that it's willed or beloved by the god is only taking out or only capturing the certain kind of affect or quality of what the right thing to do would be. It would not be the thing in itself. And so those kinds of objections move us between this kind of polytheistic, perhaps ancient Greek concern, to a monotheistic concern that people latch onto today in this Platonic dialogue. So keep this in mind. It's a very important point in the dialogue. Let me go over points 6, 7, and 8 a little more quickly. There are a couple of other proposals from Euthyphro after that crux. So in 6, there is this kind of discussion that perhaps what Socrates and Euthyphro agree upon for a moment is perhaps that there is something which we can call justice, and that there's a relation between justice and piety. Namely, the justice is the larger entity or the larger set, and that justice has to do with the care of men. Whereas inside of justice, there are different ways of diagramming this. I'll just do it this way. The piety is just a part of justice, where piety is the care of the gods. And there are different analogies which are drawn by Socrates in order to understand this. If we take just one kind of analogy, we can say that in the case of numbers, in the set of all numbers, well, inside that set of numbers are numbers which have a particular property of being oddness. So 3, 5, 7, 9 are odd numbers, but there are more numbers than that, namely all the even numbers. And so in the same way, piety is a subset of what justice is. Now, in suggesting this, it takes us right into step number 7, which just is this proposal from Euthyphro. The piety is the care of the gods. And I want to just combine that with step number 8, because the kind of response to both is very similar. In step number 8, the proposal is not just that piety is the care of the gods, but rather the piety consists of certain kinds of actions. Actions which, frankly, we might have thought Euthyphro would have started with. Actions like prayer, like performing the right kinds of rituals and rites, or sacrifices to the gods. Socrates also seems dissatisfied with all of these answers. He begins asking Euthyphro questions like, well, if piety is the care of the gods, the kind of 6-7 combination, in what way do we care for the gods? And Euthyphro says some things like in the way that slaves take care of their masters, or the way that servants take care of their masters in the house. And in investigating those kinds of goals or those kinds of activities, Socrates wants to know what's the ultimate aim of slaves taking care of their masters in this way? What's the ultimate goal of these actions? And Euthyphro just admits, he says it's very hard to say. It's difficult to say what the goals or the aims or the purposes of those actions would be. And then in virtue of saying, well, maybe it's not just a matter of taking care of the gods in the right way. It's a matter of honoring them in the right way through prayer or rituals or sacrifices. And then Socrates suggests, well, is this something like a bit of a trading skill between, as if it would be a trading between men, but it's a trading skill between men between the men and gods. And Euthyphro says that seems like a right kind of idea, an apt analogy. But then Socrates says this: it seems as though when we trade items, or in these virtues of these trading skills, it seems as though both parties would benefit. And how exactly do the gods benefit from these prayers and from these rituals and from these sacrifices? And it's here that Euthyphro says something which sounds very familiar. Well, again, it's a little bit hard to say, but it seems as though it's just pleasing to the gods to receive these prayers, rituals, and sacrifices. But then, if it's just pleasing, this seems as though it's very similar to what we've already heard from Euthyphro. That whatever piety is, it's just what's pleasing or what's beloved or what is dear to the gods. And so Socrates, near the end, says, well, it seems like we've already discussed that answer in a couple of different ways. And so either it's the case that we were wrong before, or we're wrong now. And so we'll have to take up this investigation again from the beginning. And it's at this point that, in bringing out all of these problematic answers, in trying to induce Euthyphro to see why these different proposals don't quite work in the way that he would hope that they would, Euthyphro gives up. And this is a common theme amongst the interlocutors of Socrates. By the end of most of the dialogues, they all say, look, I have somewhere else to be. I'm in a hurry. I have to get going. And it seems as though Socrates is always a bit dissatisfied, perhaps puzzled. And in fact, it seems as though what he's done is always shown the person that he's been talking to something important. That they claim that they've known something, they have claimed to know something. In virtue of investigating the idea of what it is that they claim to know, it's been revealed, both to Socrates and to the person that he's interrogating, that that person really might not know. In fact, seems not to know what the idea, in this case, the idea of piety, actually is. And so inevitably, people end up finding Socrates a bit annoying. As you can imagine, he's kind of annoying in this way. And yet, you might ask yourself, do you think that he's being authentic? Do you think he's being genuine when he's asking these questions? Or do you think that there's something ironic about his character, or both, or neither? Because on the one hand he says, well, Euthyphro, it seems if you're so wise in the ways of piety, you should be able to teach me what it is. And so you'll be my teacher and I'll be your student. And yet, throughout this dialogue, and throughout many Socratic dialogues, it seems as though Socrates is the one teaching something to the person he's talking with. What is he teaching them? Well, nothing in particular. No particular piece of content, no particular idea. It seems like as though through the Socratic method, what he's teaching them is to investigate what it is that they claim to know, to investigate their own knowledge. Because it might turn out that they don't actually know what they claim. And so in this way, there's a kind of humility to this interrogation that Socrates is endeavoring to interrogate people who were living in Athens at the time. So this is the end of the dialogue. There's a few things, so I will leave it there. There are a few things I want to say about Søren Kierkegaard. I'll try to make that fairly brief. That's the end of our first Platonic dialogue.